The desert heat of Mesa, Arizona has a way of swallowing sound, of stretching silence until it feels like something alive, something watching. And in the summer of 2008, that silence would wrap itself around a story so dark, so obsessive, and so violently intimate that it would grip the entire nation for years to come.
This is not just the story of a murder, but of a relationship that spiraled into control, jealousy, and something far more dangerous.
More complicated than anyone initially realized, especially after two people became closely connected in a story that would later draw intense public attention. Nothing about their first encounter suggested the ending that waited for them. There were no warning signs that screamed loud enough, no flashing red lights, just a connection that felt, at least on the surface, intense and immediate.
They met at a business conference, one of those events where ambition hangs thick in the air, where people are chasing success,
recognition, a better version of themselves, and Jodi stood out. Quiet, observant, but when she spoke, she had a way of drawing people in. One of the individuals at the center of the story was widely described by friends and acquaintances as outgoing, ambitious, and highly social. Someone who believed in personal growth, in redemption, in the idea that people could transform themselves into something better. And for Jodi, that idea wasn't just appearing, it became a blueprint. Because shortly after meeting Travis, she began to change.
Converting to his religion, reshaping her identity in ways that, at first glance, seemed like devotion, like commitment, like love.
But underneath that transformation, something else was forming. Something more consuming. Something that blurred the line between affection and obsession. Their relationship moved fast. Faster than either of them probably realized. And it wasn't simple. It wasn't clean, because while Travis tried to maintain a certain image, devout, disciplined, morally grounded, his relationship with Jodi existed in a kind of shadow.
Filled with contradictions, late-night phone calls, secret meetings, moments of intimacy followed by distance.
And that push and pull became the fuel that kept everything burning. Friends would later describe how Travis struggled with the relationship, how he confided that something didn't feel right, that Jodi could be possessive, that her presence lingered in ways that made it hard for him to breathe freely, and yet he didn't fully cut ties, not completely, because emotional entanglement has a way of tightening its grip the more you try to loosen it, and Jodi, for her part, seemed unwilling to let go at all. As time went on, the cracks widened, arguments grew sharper, the emotional stakes climbed higher.
And what once might have been seen as passion began to look more like control, like surveillance, like an inability to accept separation.
There were reports of her showing up uninvited, of accessing his accounts, of inserting herself into his life even when he tried to create distance. And for Travis, that tension became a source of stress, something he confided in friends about, something that made him uneasy. But uneasiness doesn't always translate into action, not immediately, and sometimes, by the time it does, it's already too late.
June 4, 2008. Began like any other day in the quiet suburban neighborhood where Travis lived.
A place where nothing outwardly suggested the violence that was about to unfold behind closed doors. But what happened inside that house would later be reconstructed piece by piece, detail by chilling detail. As additional details emerged, the timeline of events surrounding the case drew intense public attention and widespread discussion. And what followed was not a sudden, inexplicable act, but something that seemed to build, to escalate, to reach a breaking point, where whatever boundaries had once existed were completely erased. The evidence would later show that Travis was attacked in his own bathroom.
Vulnerable, unprepared, the setting itself adding a layer of intimacy that made the violence even more disturbing.
Because this was not a distant, detached act. This was personal, close, relentless. He suffered multiple stab wounds, far more than what would be considered necessary to end a life, and that detail alone speaks volumes, because overkill often points to something deeper, something emotional, something driven by rage, fear, or a desperate need for control. There was also a gunshot wound,
a final, devastating act that ensured there was no coming back, and when you step back and look at the totality of the violence,
it becomes clear that this was not a momentary lapse, not a single action taken in panic, but a sustained attack, one that unfolded over time, one that required a level of determination that is difficult to comprehend. After the murder, the scene left behind was one of chaos, but also of silence, because for days, no one knew what had happened. Travis missed calls, missed obligations. First, there may have been concern, but not immediate alarm, because life has a way of creating gaps, of making absence seem explainable.
When friends finally entered his home and discovered his body, the reality of the situation hit with full force.
And from that moment on, the investigation began to peel back the layers of what had happened, uncovering details that only made the story more unsettling.
As the investigation continued, public attention increasingly focused on differing accounts and evolving details connected to the case.
Timelines that didn't quite align, and what made it even more chilling was how she initially presented herself. Calm, composed, cooperative.
Offering explanations that seemed designed to distance herself from the crime. At first, she denied being there, claimed she hadn't seen Travis.
That she had no involvement, but as evidence mounted, as forensic details placed her at the scene, the narrative changed. And that evolution of her story would become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the case. She later admitted to being present, but claimed it was a home invasion, that masked intruders were responsible, a version of events that investigators found increasingly difficult to believe, and eventually, the story shifted again, this time to self-defense, a claim that she had been the victim of abuse. But the physical evidence suggested a level of aggression and persistence.
That went far beyond what would typically be associated with self-defense. The trial that followed became a national spectacle.
Not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the psychological complexity of the relationship, the conflicting narratives. During the courtroom proceedings, extensive testimony and highly publicized interviews became major points of public discussion. And for many watching, the question wasn't just what happened, but why? What drives a person to that point? What combination of factors turns a relationship into something lethal? Prosecutors painted a picture of premeditation,
pointing to evidence that suggested planning, including the rental car, the purchase of items that could be linked to the crime,
and the effort to cover her tracks afterward, while the defense focused on the idea of a relationship marked by manipulation and fear. Attempting to reframe the narrative as one of survival rather than aggression, the jury was left to navigate these competing versions, to weigh the evidence against the testimony, to decide where the truth lay in a case where emotions ran high and details were deeply disturbing. What made the case particularly gripping was the glimpse it offered into the dynamics of a relationship that had become toxic.
Where boundaries were blurred, where attachment turned into fixation, and where the inability to let go may have played a central role.
As the trial unfolded, every detail was examined, and the public followed closely, drawn in by the combination of human drama and criminal investigation, trying to make sense of something that, at its core, defied simple explanation. When the verdict was finally reached, it marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of the fascination, because even after the legal process concluded, questions lingered. Debates continued, and the story remained a point of reference for discussions about relationships, warning signs, and the darker side of human connection. In the end, the Jodi Arias case stands as a stark reminder of how quickly things can escalate when emotional intensity crosses into obsession, when control replaces respect, and when the lines between love and possession disappear entirely, leaving behind a trail of devastation that cannot be undone, only remembered, analyzed, and perhaps learned from if one is willing to look closely enough at the uncomfortable truths they reveal.